Greetings. In this video, I just want to share a little something that I experienced on social media yesterday and today. And I admit up front that this video is going to have somewhat of a cheap and salacious quality to it. And for that, I apologize. It's not my intention. But I did think this was worth sharing nonetheless. You see, yesterday, a gentleman on Facebook had shared one of my Facebook posts. And in that Facebook post, I was discussing some recent claims that the Teo twins had made about genetics. And this gentleman, as you see at the top of the screen, he took the approach that basically people should forget about genetics and focus on the Bible, right? That genetics is, just a waste of time for the most part. So, in the discussion, I tried to get him to clarify his position. And, his approach was basically that, you use the Bible to identify who descends patrilineally from Jacob. You don't use genetics. Fine. When I asked him to elaborate on his methodology, unfortunately, he never got into it. And, you can look through this at your leisure. But at one point, just a few hours ago, he recommended the most recent video by Benayah Israel, which you see linked to right there at the top of the screen. And so I took a look at the video. It's only 15 minutes long. Honestly, it was not at all relevant to the correspondence which I was having with that gentleman on Facebook. You see, the focus of the Facebook correspondence was the question of via what methodology do you determine a modern individual's paternal lineage across millennia? And that question certainly does not get answered by this 15-minute video. Whatever the case, the video is apparently an excerpt from Benayah Israel's documentary, Reclaiming the Throne, which you have to pay to see. And now, I've seen sizable portions of that documentary. I haven't seen it all. I don't recall seeing this portion. Maybe I missed it. Whatever the case, I wanted to discuss it briefly because it struck me as potentially corroborating a suspicion I've had about some of the research that goes into these videos. And that's a suspicion or impression that certain folks are doing quick keyword searches. And then if they find a source that seems to employ those keywords in a way which they were hoping, they quickly run with that source without taking a closer look at the source and its surrounding context and stuff like that. And so I'd like to look at a couple of examples that, as I alluded to at the beginning, this is going to be somewhat of a controversial subject, maybe perhaps I should say somewhat of an emotionally challenging subject, and I do suspect that a bit of emotional manipulation, it's arguable that a little bit of emotional manipulation is at play in these videos. But whatever the case, I want to look at these clips and note where the emphasis is placed, and then take a look at the sources being referenced. And so I'm going to pick up the first clip at about the 1 minute 5 second mark here. Listen to this.
Dylan waited in hope for the next auto to fade. And after a length of time, he was roused one night by the goalers bearing lights. Having dressed himself and put on a black garment striped with white lines and a pair of drawers, which they had brought for him, he was led into the gallows for hanging, where he joined about 200 other prisoners, all ranged against the walls. They were mostly colored men. Oh, let me say that again. They were mostly colored men, there being only about 12 white persons amongst the 200. The Inquisition revealed in its origin policy cruelty in history in Spain, Portugal, and France by Reverend Timpson.
Okay, so here's the relevant text. As he said, it's from Thomas Timpson's The Inquisition Revealed, and on your screen is the relevant portion which they read. However, here's a question. When watching that, did you get the impression that they were referring to an event that took place in India? I actually asked the gentleman that I was having the correspondence with about that, and he didn't have the foggiest clue why I was bringing up India. But nonetheless, it is the fact that this was taking place in India. The book is describing events, well, not the book, but certainly this page, it's page 259 of Timpson's work, right at the top of the page. this section is titled In Goa because it was taking place in Goa, in India. And that's why on the same page, it goes on to say, it talks about how at daybreak, the citizens of Goa, etc., right? In fact, if you turned just a few pages back to page 255, it's the section on Delon starts by saying Dr. Delon was a French physician who traveled in India for some time. In the year 1673, he resided at Damião, a city of Goa, right? So this was taking place in India. They wanted to focus on the morphologies of the prisoners, but is that surprising if this is taking place in India? I don't know. Food for thought. It's a minor point, but it seemed worth mentioning. Whatever the case, I'm going to show just one more clip in this video, and this clip will pick up at about the 4-minute mark. I thought this was more significant, perhaps you could even say more egregious, in terms of its misreading of the text. It does, at the very least, or at best, it captures what I was alluding to earlier, this tendency to, do a quick keyword search and then run with a source without looking closely at it. But at worst, it might reveal a sort of problem with comprehending what one is reading. And, for me, it was somewhat reminiscent of the faux controversy from last January in which Kelly Richardson was accusing Garfield Reid of misrepresenting Francis Moore's travels into the inland parts of Africa. And that was covered in a video on Faithful to God's channel. I'll link to it in the video description. But it was revealed back then, in January, that when you take a close look at Kelly Richardson's reading of the relevant text, which he was accusing Garfield Reid of misunderstanding, it turned out there was a problem with Kelly Richardson's own comprehension of the text. And I think a question of reading comprehension might have to be raised here, but if we're going to be more charitable, we'd say that maybe they didn't take a very close look at the text which they were reading. Nonetheless, let's take a look at this clip and note where the emphasis is placed.
Labyrinth, a secretary of the Court of Blood, says of this massacre in her book, Critical History of the Inquisition, that they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes and the vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors, to which they kept constantly adding fuel. 12 centuries of Jewish persecution, a brief outline of the sufferings of the Hebrew race in Christian lands, by Gustav Pearlson, 1898. So in the massacre of 1506 in Portugal, according to the author, they slew and mangled their victims while casting many still alive into the fire. Negroes.
Okay, so this is the text that they were looking at, Gustav Pearlson's 12 Centuries of Jewish Persecution. It's actually from page 259 of the work. And when you actually look at this text, you can see that, unfortunately, they misunderstood it. They misread it. Now, I'm going to focus on the portion that they focused on. However, I'm not going to repeat the racial categorization, the morphological reference, has the potential to bring a strike down on the video. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to say men instead of the relevant morphological term. So, if you see men, you're going to hear me say men, but I'm referring to this term, okay? So this is the text that they read. They slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires the men and vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors. So here's the thing. They interpreted the text to mean that the men were being thrown into the fire. However, what the text is actually, these specific men, they were the ones who were feeding the fire. They weren't the ones being thrown into the fire, right? Now, this could be more clear, but let's take a look at the source of this text, right? So when you go down to the bottom of the page, there's a little number 1 there at the bottom, and it says cited by Lindo. And what that refers to is this book, The History of the Jews of Spain and Portugal by Elias Haim Lindo, right? And on page 352 of Lindo's work, you find the same text being quoted. However, Lindo quotes more of it, right? you see, Gustav Pearlson was quoting from Elias Haim Lindo, and Elias Haim Lindo was quoting still another source, which we'll show in a minute. But just first, I wanted to make clear that Lindo here is showing the same text, right? And so the relevant portion which we were looking at is found right here, right, where it talks about the people being cast into the fires which the men and vilest rabble had kindled, right? Now, the quote goes on to the very next page, which is page 353, and then when you go down to the bottom of this excerpt, you finally find the source, right? So you see there's a little footnote there at the end of the word Christians, and then when you go down to the bottom, there's the reference. It's the Chronica do Rei Manuel, right? And that's actually referring to this work, Chronica do Felicissimo Rei Dom Emanuel, which is available online. It's available at archive.org, and I'll share a link in the video description to this work as well. The relevant text being quoted comes up on page 105 verso. So the pages are front and back, recto and verso, so it's the back of page 105, or as you see there, it's chapter 102. And so here's the relevant section on your right, and the portion which refers to the men being thrown into the fire, right? So I'll just read from here, right? So the text is in Portuguese, and the section that they were reading is right here, and it talks about os corpos mortos, meos vivos, the dead bodies and those who were still half alive, and then it says they're being thrown em fogueras, which is into like bonfires, que tinham feitas na Ribeira, which is that's a place. So these fires were set in the Ribeira. I know that didn't appear in the English translation, but this is nonetheless the text which was being quoted. And if I scroll here, this is the relevant section. And as you look at the original Portuguese text, you realize that the English text we were reading wasn't exactly like a straight translation. It was sort of an English paraphrase, right? Because as I was saying, the text doesn't actually use a morphological reference to the relevant people who were helping fuel the fire, right? But nonetheless, at the top of your screen, it says here, "Qual negocio y serviam escravos e mozos," right? Escravos is not a morphological term. It means slaves, right? And mozos literally means like young people. I'm guessing in light of the way the English translation interpreted it, maybe it meant something like young punks. That's why I came up with vilest rabble. But whatever the case, right? It says, escravos e mozos que com muita diligência acarretavam leña e outros materiais para acender o fogo, right? That these slaves and young punks, which with great diligence, were supplying the different materials to help the fire stay burning, right? So whether you're actually looking at the English text that they referenced, or you go to the Portuguese text, which the English translation was loosely paraphrasing, you see that the relevant men who were referred to by a morphological term in the English text and called slaves in the Portuguese text, these relevant men were not the ones being thrown into the fire. Rather, they were participating in keeping the fire burning. So I just wanted to make that clear. Whatever the case, as I said, you don't really need to go that far. When you look at the English text itself, which they themselves were quoting, you see that they badly misunderstood it. And I do think there's a question of reading comprehension here. So, or at the very least, maybe that's not very charitable. Perhaps the most charitable thing to say is that they are way too hasty and perhaps even sloppy in their handling of these texts, because I do think that they're rushing through it. They're doing quick keyword searches and then quickly grabbing stuff. Or perhaps other people are doing that and they're just borrowing these interpretations from other people. Who knows? Whatever the case, right, here's the question I suppose we should ask it now that we're at the end of the video, and that is, what is the ultimate point here, right? What might we say as part of an attempt to tie together the disparate and meandering points covered in this video, right? I would propose that the common theme here is a need to slow down the various conversations, or the various, to focus better on the various points which are under discussion in a given conversation, right? You see, in these various conversations and correspondences and so forth, I'm left with the impression that there's this tendency to jump from one topic to the next, right? To make a claim, to then want to divert attention away from that claim, to introduce a new claim or a new discussion topic, and to then divert from that topic. And you see that in this video where, we're discussing DNA, and then someone's saying, forget DNA, just focus on the Bible. And then that moves on to, forget about the Bible, watch this video on the Inquisition. And the overall trend is, again, it's one of hastiness, right? That's probably the best word to use here, hastiness, where claims are put out there, arguments are presented, but people grow uncomfortable very quickly, perhaps even bored. And if you try to take the time to focus carefully on a specific claim or a specific argument, they grow annoyed, right? So that's what I would propose ultimately, right? If you're serious about any particular topic, take the time to look at it slowly, right? And even if you don't want to take the time to do so, at the very least, don't get annoyed when others try to carefully examine a point of discussion, right? Whether it's with genetics or interpreting the Bible or looking at an excerpt from a history book, don't rush through it, or at least allow others to move through it carefully. Don't get upset, don't get annoyed, don't act bored, as others take the time to look at it, right? And don't declare the topic over simply because you've grown bored or you're no longer comfortable with where the discussion, the direction that the discussion's moving in, right? But whatever the case, on that note, as always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.